My best friend Hannah was dead, and the man we both loved watched as the jury called me her killer. My name is Claire Anderson. For 20 years, I've been inmate 409. Hannah wasn't just my best friend, she was the sister I chose. And Mark. Mark was the man I loved, long before he became her husband. When she died, my silence was my confession. I let them believe the lie. I thought it was the only way to protect what was left of her memory. The sound of the steel bolt sliding shut became the soundtrack to my new life. That first night, the cold didn't come from the concrete floor. It came from the truth I had swallowed. The metallic clang of the cell door locking wasn't just a sound. It was the end of my world and the beginning of my penance. I spent 20 years in that silence, staring at the gray walls, letting the guilt of what I didn't do eat me alive. I was serving a sentence for murder, but the real prison. The real prison was the betrayal I kept locked inside me. I thought the grave held all the secrets. I thought the truth died with Hannah. I never imagined that 20 years later, the dead would be the one to finally speak. After 21 years, prison ceases to be a place. It becomes a rhythm. It's a slow, sickly pulse that dictates your breathing. You learn to live within it. You learn to find God in the little things, in the caustic smell of industrial bleach on Monday mornings, which signifies cleanliness, in the low, steady hum of fluorescent lights in the hallway, which means you're not alone in the dark, in the 5 a.m. countdown, where 1,000 women rise in unison, an army of khaki-clad ghosts, none truly awake, but all proving they've survived another night. It's a life sentence, measured not in time, but in repetition. I accepted my penance. I became inmate 409, the model prisoner, the silent woman who never caused trouble, the woman who bowed her head and read her Bible. I became a ghost, haunting the edges of my own life, my memory of Hannah and Mark locked in an iron box at the back of my mind, a box I never, ever dared open. Guilt. Guilt was my cellmate. It was real, even if the crime wasn't. I wasn't guilty of murder. I was guilty of silence, guilty of letting the truth die just to protect a shadow. And then, on an ordinary, gray, uneventful Tuesday, the 21st year, 4th month, 7th day of my sentence, the rhythm broke. It happened during the morning countdown. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and cold metal. We were all standing beside our beds, waiting for the sound of the guard's footsteps. Officer Miller, a woman whose face was a permanent mask of weather-beaten indifference, stopped abruptly in my cell. She never stopped in my cell. My heart gave a single painful lurch against my ribs. "Anderson," she barked, her voice like gravel. "You have a legal visit, now." The entire cell seemed to hold its breath. Legal visits were rare and never good. They meant trouble, a parole denial, a new charge, or death outside. I walked behind her, the sound of my worn boots echoing in the concrete hallway. Every step felt like a judgment. I assumed it was my parole denial, another routine stamp on my lifer file. But when I was led into the glass and metal visiting room, it wasn't my public defense attorney. He was a young man in a cheap suit who looked uncomfortable, his eyes too alert for the dull surroundings. He held a briefcase like a shield. "Mrs. Anderson," he said, his voice too sharp for the quiet room. "My name is Mr. Harris. I'm an investigator with the state's Innocence Project." The low hum of the fluorescent light above us, a sound I'd stopped noticing a decade ago, suddenly seemed deafening. The Innocence Project. They were here by mistake. They helped the innocent. And even though I'd never declared myself as such. I'd accepted the deal. I'd accepted the blame. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, clearly nervous. "Ms. Anderson, we've been contacted by Hannah Collins's parents." Her name. Hearing her name aloud, in that room, was like being hit with ice water. "They've filed a final petition," he continued, "to have Hannah's body exhumed." The room went eerily silent. The air was sucked from my lungs. Exhumed, the word hung between us like a poisonous gas. "Why?" I whispered, and my own voice sounded strange, like dust falling from an old shelf. The investigator looked down at his notes, avoiding my eyes. "Her parents are dying," he said, and there was a hint of compassion in his voice that irritated me. "They want peace. They want to use modern forensic technology, things that didn't exist 20 years ago, for a new analysis. The court approved it this morning." I looked at the document he slid across the table, but the black letters danced. Exhumation. A word from horror stories. A desecration. Not something that happened in my silent, ordered penance. They would disturb her rest. They would unearth the past I buried myself alive to protect. For 21 years, I held the line. I protected Mark, yes. But more importantly, I protected memory of Hannah of Truth Real, a truth far uglier, far dirtier than the jealously pure lie the jury heard. I believed my silence was an act of mercy, a final gift to my friend. Now, her parents' dying wish was about to tear everything apart. My hands shook, and I hid them under the table. "We expect the procedure to take place within a week," Harris said. "It's quick." I just nodded. I had no voice. I was dismissed. As I walked back to my cell, the familiar sound of the heavy steel door closing behind me felt different. It was no longer the sound of my protection. It was the sound of my tomb being sealed. I sat on my bunk, the thin mattress sinking under my weight. The silence of my cell, which had always been my refuge, was now screaming. They were searching for evidence. They were searching for my DNA, by my mistake. But I realized with a cold, terrifying clarity that chilled my blood. I wasn't the only person in that house the night Hannah died, and I knew suddenly, with absolute certainty, they weren't going to find Themai's secret. They were going to find the share, and I didn't know which one scared me more. For a prisoner, memory is a double-edged sword. Most days, it's your only escape, your only private sanctuary. It's the smell of fresh-cut grass from childhood, the taste of a ripe peach in summer, the warm touch of your mother's hand. You cultivate these memories like a secret garden to survive the concrete. But that night, after Mr. Harris left me with the word exhumed echoing in my head, memory wasn't an escape. It was the prison itself. The news had unlocked a door I'd kept closed for 7,432 days. The silence of my cell, which I'd cultivated like a monastery for 2 decades, suddenly filled with the sound of rain. That night's rain. 21 years ago, but I could feel the damp chill in my bones as if it were happening now. I vividly remember the smell of Hannah's wet porch wood. I shouldn't have been there. It was foolish. Jealousy makes you foolish, and the court was right about that part. Mark and we had broken up months before. He left me, and within a week, he was with her, my best friend, the one person in the world I couldn't hate. But love doesn't die cleanly. It rots. It leaves ghosts. And I was a ghost that night, drawn back to their house, the house that should have been mine, drenched by the storm, staring out the living room window. I just wanted to see them, to see if they were happy, to see the life I'd lost. The house was dark. That was what worried me. Mark must be home. The front door was slightly ajar, the wind making it knock softly against the frame, an irregular, sickening rhythm. It was the silence that drew me in. It was the same wrong silence that now filled my cell, a silence that wasn't peaceful, but empty. "Hannah," I called. My voice was shrill, swallowed by the entryway. The only sound was the loud ticking of the grandfather clock in the dining room and the rain pounding outside. The air was still and cold. I climbed the stairs, my heart pounding against my ribs, each step creaking on the old wood. And that's when I saw her. She was slumped at the top of the stairs, awkwardly. The Persian rug she loved so much was bunched beneath her, her blonde hair spread like a dark halo against the polished wood floor. I didn't see the blood, not at first. I only saw her eyes, open, empty, fixed on something beyond me, something on the ceiling. I remember kneeling, my hand shaking uncontrollably as I reached for her, my fingers touching her cheek. It was cold, so cold. That's when my hand brushed against her cream cashmere sweater, the one I'd given her for her birthday. It was wet, but not from the rain. I looked at my hand. It was red. That's when I saw the small, dark, almost polite spot on her chest, right above her heart. And I knew. I knew she was gone. That's when Mark arrived. But he didn't run up the stairs. He didn't burst through the front door, shouting her name over the storm. No. He came out of the office at the end of the hall, his home office. He'd been there the whole time. He was pale, his eyes unnaturally wide, and he held a half-empty glass of whiskey. He looked at her body, then looked at me, kneeling, with a bloody hand. The smell of his whiskey cut through the cold air. "She's gone, Claire," he whispered. And then he looked straight at me, and his expression changed. The confusion vanished. The sadness didn't appear. It was calculation. A cold, quick click behind his eyes. "Oh my God, Claire," he said, his voice a miracle of false anguish. "What have you done?" That was it. Just that. He didn't scream. He didn't run to her. He didn't try to save her. He just stood there 10 paces away and watched me become the killer. And I was silent. I didn't tell him he'd been there the whole time. I didn't ask why he hadn't heard her fall. I didn't ask about his business dealings, about the debts I knew Hannah had just discovered, about the angry phone calls I'd overheard her having with him the week before, where she'd screamed that she would expose everything. I just looked at the man I still loved, at the body of the woman we both loved, and I made a choice. My heart broke, and silence took its place. And 21 years later, sitting on that hard bunk, I finally understood. My silence wasn't a sacrifice for love. It was cowardice. I wasn't protecting Hannah's memory. I was protecting Mark. And now they were digging. The next 7 days were the longest of my entire sentence. 21 years is an eternity, but it's a slow, predictable eternity, like molasses dripping in the cold. You get used to the rhythm. You learn to breathe in time with the steel doors slamming at 6 in the morning and the lights going out at 10 at night. Time isn't your friend, but it's a constant companion. This wait, however, was different. It was an active time, a hungry time. It was a predator circling outside my cell. Prison is built on waiting, waiting for the count, waiting for food, waiting for the mail, waiting for parole, waiting for death. But this was a wait with teeth. Every time the food slot in my steel door opened with its familiar metallic squeak, my heart leaped into my throat, thinking it was news. Every time an inmate's name was called over the loudspeaker, I held my breath, my hands clenching into fists. I became a violin string stretched to its fullest, vibrating with an energy bordering on panic. The silence I had perfected for 2 decades was gone. My mind was a screaming chaos. The other women in the wing noticed, of course. In prison, you survive by reading the air currents, and I suddenly became a hurricane. I, the model prisoner, the silent ghost who never caused trouble, the Sister Claire who read the Bible in the courtyard, now I couldn't sit still. I skipped breakfast for 3 days straight, something I never did. The food, already tasteless, now felt like ash in my mouth. During recess, I no longer went to my quiet corner. I paced. I paced in tight circles near the barbed wire fence, like a caged animal, which I supposed I was. Maria, the woman in the next cell who was serving time for fraud, watched me with her small, shrewd eyes over her lunch tray. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Anderson," she murmured, her voice low so the guards wouldn't hear. I stopped pacing and looked at her. The smell of overcooked potatoes hung in the air. "Maybe I'm about to see," I replied, my voice harsh. She raised an eyebrow but shrugged. "In prison, you learn not to ask questions. Questions are more dangerous than answers, and curiosity can kill you faster than a blade." They gave me space. I was a wounded animal, and they didn't know if I would bite or bleed to death. I barely slept. When the lights went out, the darkness of the cell became a screen. When I closed my eyes, I didn't see the cracked ceiling. I saw dirt. I saw cold shovels cutting through the damp soil. I saw Hannah's pale face being brought back into the daylight, her empty eyes still fixed on me. I wondered about the process. Would it be clinical? Cold? Would they be kind? I found myself praying, not for my innocence, but for her dignity, praying that the past would be kept quiet. But a part of me, a small, terrified part I barely recognized, was praying the opposite. It was praying that they would find something, because 21 years is a long time to carry a burden that isn't yours. 21 years is enough time for loyalty to rot and turn to poison. The silence I chose to protect Hannah's memory had become my own tomb, and now they were opening hers. The irony was almost poetic. I found myself thinking about Mark. Where was he? Did he know? Was he sleeping soundly in some expensive bed? Or was he, like me, awake in the dark, waiting for the sound of the earth being turned? Mr. Harris said a week. The 8th day came and went. Nothing. The 9th day. Silence. Tension began to turn to despair. They found nothing. It was all in vain. That small glimmer of, it wasn't hope, it was change, was disappearing. My 21-year routine was coming back to claim me. I'd been a fool to let an investigator in a cheap suit disturb my peace. And then, on the 10th day, in the middle of lunch, the call came. Anderson, forensic visit. The entire cafeteria fell silent. The sound of my metal tray scraping against the table sounded like thunder. I stood. The walk back to the visiting room seemed miles long. Each step was a hammer pounding on my nerves. I entered the room. There he was, Mr. Harris. He wasn't nervous like the first time. His face was different. That young lawyer's nervousness had vanished, replaced by something I couldn't quite place. It was a mixture of pity, confusion, and amazement. He didn't sit down immediately. "Mrs. Anderson," he began, his voice strangely soft. "The exhumation has been completed." I waited, my entire body feeling like stone. "As expected," he continued, "the initial forensics confirmed the cause of death, the time, everything as at the original trial." My stomach sank. That was it. The last door closed. I nodded, ready to be escorted back, ready for my next 20 years of silence. "But," he said, and he leaned forward, his eyes fixed on mine. "We found something. Something that wasn't in the original autopsy report. Something that shouldn't have been there." I stared at him. The air in the sterile visiting room seemed to have solidified. The hum of the fluorescent light, which had previously been background noise, now seemed to be singing in a high, deafening tone. "What?" I said, and the word came out as a dry scratch. "What do you mean, shouldn't be there?" I wasn't breathing. I'd forgotten how. Mr. Harris was no longer acting like a nervous young investigator. There was a gravity to him now, a weight. He sat, his hands flat on the folder on the metal table. "When the forensic team moved Hannah's body," he said, his voice low and methodical, "they noticed an irregularity in the silk lining of the coffin, near the head. The original coroner must have thought it was just part of the stuffing, or perhaps a manufacturing defect. But my team, they're meticulous. They opened it." He paused, and his eyes met mine, holding my gaze with an intensity that startled me. "It was sewn inside, Claire. A small object, wrapped in thick plastic and sealed with duct tape. Someone wanted it to be found someday, but not easily." He opened the folder. From inside, he took out not an object, but a photograph of a small plastic evidence bag. Inside the bag, visible even in the low-quality photo, was a stained, folded piece of paper. "It looks like a letter." My heart, which I thought had stopped, began to beat erratically, painfully, like a fist against the back of my ribs. A letter. In her coffin. Hidden. This was Hannah. It had always been Hannah. She never did anything halfway. Even in death, she had to have the last word, the last secret. My mind raced, trying to understand. How? Who? "We haven't gotten a court order to open it yet," he said quickly. "But—" I cut him off. "But you did," I whispered. I saw it in his eyes. Legality was one thing, but truth was another. He looked away for a moment, a silent confirmation. "The court opened it this morning, in the presence of a judge," he corrected, returning to the official script. "It's in Hannah Collins's handwriting. It's been notarized." He took a deep breath, as if bracing for impact. "Claire, the contents of this letter change everything." I braced myself. I closed my eyes for a second, waiting for the final pain, waiting for Hannah's confirmation that I had betrayed her, that she knew about me and Mark before, that she hated me. I braced myself for my best friend's final stab. "She wasn't talking about jealousy, Claire," the state's attorney said, and I hadn't even realized she'd entered the room. She was standing near the door, her face pale. She was talking about business, about her husband. I opened my eyes. The chill that had started in my feet was now a layer of ice around my heart. There it was. The truth I'd buried. "In the letter," Harris continued, taking control, "Hannah wrote that she knew Mark was embezzling money from her father's company. She wrote that he was involved with dangerous people, that he had gambling debts she couldn't even begin to fathom. She detailed account numbers, dates. She wrote that she confronted him the night before his death, and that he laughed at her. He looked at me, his expression now unreadable. And then she wrote about you." I stopped breathing again. Of course I did. The final knife. The betrayal. I was the foolish friend, the scorned lover, the perfect scapegoat. She was going to paint me as an accomplice, or as the jealous threat the prosecutor said I was. "She wrote," Harris continued, and his voice broke for just a moment. "She wrote, if something happens to me, Mark will be to blame." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But he won't act alone. He's a coward. He'll use the one person he knows would never betray him. He'll use the one person he knows loves him more than she loves herself. He'll use Claire." The air left my lungs in a painful hiss. Oh my God. It wasn't an accusation. It was a warning. It was a prophecy. She knew. She knew what Mark was, and she knew what I was. She knew my loyalty was a weapon he would point at me. "And then," Harris said, his voice almost a whisper now, "she wrote the last line. The line the judge made us read 5 times. He looked at the report. "I'm hiding this, and I'm giving her a copy. If you're reading this, Claire, it's because I'm dead. Don't let my silence be your sentence. Save yourself. Burn it." The whole room seemed to be tilting. The state's attorney cleared her throat. "Burn him, Mark." The name of the partner he was stealing from was Ash, Robert Ash. Ash means ash. Burn Ash. Burn the ash. We thought she was talking about the scheme, but burn him. Mark. She was shaking. "A copy," I whispered, and suddenly the buzzing in my head stopped, replaced by a single, clear memory. She gave me a copy. Mr. Harris and the state's attorney stared at me. "What do you mean, Claire?" Harris said, his voice urgent now, leaning across the table. "What copy?" And the memory, which had been submerged under 21 years of guilt and trauma, emerged with violent clarity. "A week," I said, my voice shaking. "It was a week before she died. We met for coffee. It was the first time we'd seen each other in months since she and Mark got together. The memory was bittersweet. The smell of the coffee shop, the sound of the espresso machine. I remember thinking how tired she looked. There were dark circles under her eyes that used to be so bright. She was nervous, stirring her coffee, barely touching it. I assumed it was embarrassment. I assumed it was because for our broken friendship, for the guilt of staying with the man I loved. I was so absorbed in my own pain that I barely heard her. But now I did. I heard every word. "I thought it was about us," I continued, speaking more to myself than to them. But she was scared. She looked at the door every time the bell rang. I remember her forcing a smile, her hands shaking. She handed me a small white envelope, sealed with tape. It was thin but heavy for its size. "Don't open it now, Claire," she said, her voice low and urgent. "It's just a backup. Work stuff. I'm scared Mark will lose everything in the system. Can you keep it for me? Just for a few days? I'll let you know when it's safe." I agreed, of course. I was the reliable friend. I was the rock. I took the envelope, relieved that she still trusted me with something. Anything. I desperately wanted to be her friend again, more than I hated Mark. I took it, put it in my bag, and with the tension between us, I forgot about it. I took it home and put it in my desk drawer, the drawer where I kept my old diaries, and then, a week later, I found her dead. "The cops," I said, looking at Harris, my eyes widening with the horror of realization. "They came. They searched my apartment. They found the envelope." The state's attorney paled, her hand going to her mouth. "Exhibit B," she whispered, and the phrase hit me like a physical punch. Exhibit B. I remembered the prosecutor, a burly man with a booming voice, walking in front of the jury. He held the sealed envelope, Hannah's envelope, in the air. "Exhibit B, ladies and gentlemen," he boomed. "The defendant's diary, a record of her sick fantasies, of her jealousy, of her obsession with Mark Collins. An envelope she kept hidden in her secret drawer, detailing her hatred for Hannah Collins." I remember trying to speak. I remember shaking my head, telling my public defense attorney, "It's not a diary, I don't know what it is." And he silenced me. "It looks bad, Claire," he whispered. "It looks like you're lying." Then I stopped. I let the lie sink in. I let my silence about Mark blend with my silence about the envelope until it all became a single, suffocating confession of guilt. "The copy," I said to Harris, my voice now cold as ice. "They had it. The prosecutors. They had it all along, and they lied." Harris wasn't looking at me anymore. He was leafing through his files frantically, his cheeks flushed with adrenaline and anger. "Exhibit B," he muttered. "It was sealed after the trial. No one re-examined it. It was labeled Defendant's Personal Diary, Veiled Threats." He looked at the state's attorney, his face a mask of professional horror. My God, they never read it. They never read. The state's attorney was already on the phone. Her voice wasn't soft now, it was sharp as broken glass. "I need Exhibit B from the Anderson case, 45889, from the evidence locker, now. And I need an emergency hearing with Judge Miller. Yes, now." The room was filled with an electric energy. The truth wasn't just in Hannah's grave. It had been in a police evidence vault less than 5 miles away for 21 years. Waiting for the exhumation results was a passive terror. This was rage. A cold, pure rage that started in the soles of my feet and crept up my spine. They had it. They had the proof of my innocence, the proof of Mark's guilt, Hannah's warning. And they twisted it. They turned it into the murder weapon. They didn't need a weapon. They had my loyalty and their arrogant laziness. The state's attorney returned 6 hours later. I spent 6 hours in a holding cell, not my regular cell, but in an empty concrete room near the warden's office. When she entered, her face was as white as a sheet. She said nothing. She simply placed a document in front of me. It was an emergency motion to vacate my conviction. "The envelope," she said, her voice shaking with suppressed anger, "contained exactly what the casket letter said. Account numbers, transfer dates, an affidavit signed by Hannah detailing Mark's embezzlement, and a note stapled to it in Hannah's handwriting. Claire, if anything happens to me, turn this over to the police. He won't stop." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a professional shame that was almost as painful as my own guilt. "They never read it," she whispered. "The prosecutor, he just saw the envelope coming from you, saw the tension, and constructed his narrative. He never read what was inside." And I realized, Mark, he didn't know what was in the envelope. He just knew that Hannah gave it to me. Something he watched me be convicted, knowing that the prosecution itself held the key, and he remained silent. He let me burn. Things happened fast after that. so fast that the world became a blur, like watercolors in the rain. One day, I was in cell 409, counting the cracks in the ceiling, a ritual I'd performed for 7,438 mornings. The next day, I was in a courtroom. Not the grand, dark courtroom of my trial, filled with cameras and the hatred of Hannah's parents. This one was small, administrative, lit by harsh fluorescent lights, much like those in prison. They hadn't made me wear the orange jumpsuit. The Innocence Project bought me a cheap gray suit. The fabric felt like cardboard against my skin, rough and strange. I felt like an actress in a play I hadn't rehearsed, wearing someone else's costume. My hands were cuffed in front of me, a chain around my waist. 21 years of being a model prisoner, and they still chained me like an animal. The judge, an older man with a face that seemed to have seen it all, looked angry. Not with me, with the court, with the original prosecutor, who, I was told, had died of a heart attack a decade ago, with the system that allowed a piece of paper to be mislabeled and a life to be destroyed. Mark wasn't there. He'd been notified, I was told. He was unavailable. I bet he was. The state's attorney, the same woman whose face had been white with embarrassment hours before, now spoke with a cold, controlled anger. She read Hannah's letter aloud, the letter from the coffin. The sound of her voice reading my dead friend's words in that sterile room felt like a desecration. He will use Claire. And then she read the contents of Exhibit B, the copy Hannah had given me. The courtroom was deathly silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning. I looked at Hannah's parents. They were there, in the front row. Mr. Harris must have called them. Her father was in a wheelchair, a blanket draped over his knees. Her mother, her hair now completely white, held his hand so tightly that her knuckles were white. They were both crying. But they weren't the tears of sadness and hatred I'd seen at the original trial. They were tears of relief, of rage, of 21 years of mourning for the wronged daughter. Hannah's mother looked at me and she nodded. A small, almost imperceptible nod. And that's when my heart, which had felt like stone, began to ache. When the lawyer finished, the silence lasted an eternity. The judge cleared his throat. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, looking infinitely tired. He looked at me, and for the first time in 2 decades, a man in a position of power looked at me, not as a murderer, not as inmate 409, but as a human being. "Ms. Anderson," he said, his voice booming, "the system failed you. The system failed Hannah Collins. The original prosecutor made a mistake so gross, so devastating, that it tarnishes the reputation of this court." He tapped some papers. "Based on the irrefutable evidence presented, the coffin letter and the misinterpreted contents of Exhibit B, Claire Anderson's conviction is vacated. All charges are dismissed. You are free to go." And then he banged the gavel. The sound was sharp, dry, like a bone breaking. Free to go. 2 words. I expected the heavens to open, for a choir of angels to sing, for me to feel a weight lift from my shoulders. But I felt nothing. Just a ringing in my ears. A guard approached with a key. The click of the lock on my handcuffs was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. My hands fell to my sides, suddenly light and useless. I rubbed my wrists. "You may go, Ms. Anderson," the judge said softly. I stood, my legs like rubber. Mr. Harris placed a hand on my arm to steady me. The courtroom doors opened, and I was hit by light. Sunlight. Real, direct, not the filtered, dingy light of the prison yard. I blinked, my eyes watering. It felt aggressive. The world had moved on. There were cars that looked like spaceships, smooth and silent. People walked quickly, staring at small, glowing rectangles in their hands, their faces illuminated by a bluish light. The air smelled of car exhaust, street food, and something sweet, flowers from a nearby tree. It was the most overwhelming thing I'd ever felt. I'd entered prison at 28. I was leaving at 49. I'd lost everything: my youth, my parents, my career, my name. And for what? For a silence that was never mine to keep. I was taken to a cheap hotel. The Innocence Project would support me for a few weeks. I walked into the room. There was a queen-size bed, a flat-screen TV on the wall, a bathroom with a door that closed. I sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was soft. Too soft. I felt like I was drowning in it. For 21 years, I'd slept on a thin metal plate that barely gave. I got up and went to the bathroom. I turned on the shower. Hot water, as much as I wanted. I stayed there until the water cooled, but I still didn't feel clean. I looked in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was a stranger. Her hair was gray at the temples. There were lines around her eyes that told a story I didn't want to read. I was free, but freedom felt like just another cell, only bigger. Cell 409 had walls I could see. This one was invisible. I walked out of the bathroom, wrapped in a rough towel, and for the first time in 7,439 days, I was completely alone. And I had never felt so terrified. For the first few days, I barely left that hotel room. Freedom was an ocean, and I was afraid of drowning in the air. I ordered room service because the idea of a supermarket, with its bright lights and choices, it felt like a form of torture. The silence was the loudest thing. In prison, there is never silence. There is always the buzzing, the dripping, the echo of a scream, the muffled cry of another woman. The silence of that hotel room was absolute, and my mind rushed to fill it. I turned on the television, not to watch, but just to hear voices, to have background noise other than the sound of my own blood rushing. And that's where I saw myself. My face, older, paler than I remembered, was on every channel, innocent after 21 years. The miracle of the coffin letter. They called me a victim. They called me a survivor. They were just new labels, new words for prisoner, new uniforms I hadn't chosen. They were words that defined me by my pain, not by myself. I felt as detached from that woman on the screen as I had from inmate 409. And then they showed the face share. They showed Mark. Not the Mark of now. They didn't have recent photos. They showed the Mark of 21 years ago. The charming man in his early 30s, smiling in wedding photos next to Hannah, his arm around her waist. The man I cried for. The man I sacrificed myself for. The man who watched me being handcuffed, knowing all along. And the fog in my brain, the fog of trauma and disorientation, evaporated. It was burned by an emotion I hadn't allowed myself to feel in 21 years. Anger. But it wasn't the hot, explosive anger I saw in the other inmates. It wasn't something that broke down walls. It was cold. It was the ice of absolute clarity. It was the kind of anger that builds gallows. It was in that moment, looking into the smiling face of my betrayer, that I finally connected everything. The whole truth. He hadn't just left me take the blame. Orchestrated. He knew Hannah was scared. He knew she'd made copies. He must have guessed, or maybe she even told him, that she'd give me one. And that night, when he came out of the office and saw me there, rain-soaked, heartbroken, kneeling beside her body with blood on my hands, he didn't see a tragedy. He saw his way out. He saw the solution to all his problems. He knew my apartment would be the first place the police would search. He knew they'd find the envelope. And he knew a lazy prosecutor hungry for a conviction would see the perfect story. The scorned lover, the secret diary, the crime of passion. He didn't even need to plant the gun, Iorotha gun. He used me to clean up the crime scene of his own life. He used me to clear his name, to inherit Hannah's money, and to disappear. He didn't have to lie in court. He didn't have to testify. He just let the hungry prosecutor do the work for him, using my pain and my love for him as the motive. Jealousy was such a better narrative than greed. So much cleaner. I had spent 21 years believing my silence was a twisted act of martyrdom, a sacrifice to protect Hannah's memory from the horrible man she married. How foolish I was. How arrogant. I wasn't a martyr. I was a tool. I was the human shield Mark used to escape a burning building. Mr. Harris came to visit me at the hotel on the third night. He looked tired, but his eyes were shining with justice. "They've issued a warrant," he said, sitting stiffly in the hotel chair. "For Mark Collins, charge of first-degree murder and multiple counts of fraud." I nodded, looking at the TV, which now showed an old photo of me. "Will you find him?" He sighed. "The world is a big place, Claire. He has a 2-decade head start. But we're working with Interpol. He can't hide forever." "He can," I said, my voice sounding dead in my own ears. "He hid behind me for 21 years. I turned to the young investigator. The 28-year-old woman he'd helped free was dead. "I want to see him," I said. My voice didn't shake. "When you find him, I want to be there." Harris looked at me with concern. "Claire, maybe he's not healthy." "Healthy?" I cut him off, and for the first time, the 49-year-old woman in the mirror felt real. I spent half my life in a concrete box because of him. I lost my parents while I was in there. I buried my mother and father from my cell, reading smuggled letters that arrived weeks late. Healthy is a word that no longer applies to me. The only thing that applies is justice. I owe that to Hannah, and I owe it to myself. I had spent 21 years being silent, passive, a victim. That part of me died when that courtroom door opened. The girl who walked into prison loved Mark Collins. The woman who left was going to bury him. While I waited, the Innocence Project moved me from the hotel to a small furnished apartment. It was downtown, and the sound of traffic never stopped. They gave me a subsidy, a debit card, and a phone. A smartphone, they called it. A small, smooth, cold black rectangle that contained, they said, the whole world. I left it in the box for 3 days. I was terrified of it. I was used to a world where communication was a piece of notebook paper and a broken pencil, where news arrived 3 weeks late. That little device seemed obscenely powerful. For the first few days, I barely left the apartment. I watched TV, but I understood nothing. The commercials were fast and aggressive, shouting about medications for diseases I'd never heard of, sold by people who seemed too perfect. Everything was fast. The world had developed an edginess, a speed that made me dizzy. In prison, time doesn't move. It rots. Out here, he was running and I was standing still, a rock in the middle of a raging river. Eventually, the food Mr. Harris had stocked for me ran out. I had to leave. I had to go to a supermarket. It was the first time I'd been inside one in 21 years. The smell of baking bread and fruit hit me at the door, so overwhelming I almost recoiled. The fluorescent lights were 1,000 times brighter than the prison's, designed to make everything glow. And the colors. My God, the colors. Prison was beige, gray, orange, and navy blue. Here, it was an assault. Bright reds, neon greens. I grabbed a cart and pushed it, my hands shaking, feeling everyone's eyes on me, even though no one was looking. I was in the cereal aisle. In prison, there was a choice: stale cornflakes or tasteless oatmeal. Here, there was an entire wall. Hundreds of boxes, all screaming for attention. Honey flakes, cinnamon rings, boxes with cartoon characters, boxes promising heart health, boxes of ancient grains. I stopped. I couldn't choose. And then I saw the milk aisle. It wasn't just milk. It was 2%, whole, skim, almond milk, soy milk, oat milk. What was oat milk? I felt panic rise in my throat. It wasn't a choice. It was a burden. It was a mockery of all my non-choices for 2 decades. I couldn't breathe. The hum of the refrigerators grew louder, the lights brighter, people's voices an indecipherable roar. I dropped the cart in the middle of the aisle, an act of chaos that would have landed me in solitary confinement, and fled. I ran out of the store, into the parking lot, and leaned against a brick wall, gasping for breath, the cold afternoon air burning my lungs. The freedom of choice was physically overwhelming. I was a savage. I returned to the apartment empty-handed and cried for an hour, not from sadness, but from sheer, utter incompetence. I no longer belonged in this world. It was too bright and too fast for me. That night, I opened the phone box. I turned it on. Light. A digital assistant asked me to speak to it. I set it up, my 49-year-old hands clumsy on the glass screen, and then I did what Mr. Harris told me not to do. I connected to the internet. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. There were thousands of articles. The love triangle murder. True crime forums. People debating my guilt, my appearance, my life. People analyzing photos from my trial, arguing whether my eyes looked cold. People who, even now, after the letter, after the exhumation, they insisted I had got away with it, that I was a manipulator, that the letter was a hoax. The invisible prison had walls much higher and stronger than I ever imagined. They were digital and eternal. I hung up the phone and threw it across the room, the sound of it hitting the cheap carpet making me jump. I needed something real. The next day, I didn't try the supermarket. I went to a park. A small neighborhood park with old trees and a rusty playground. I sat on a bench. I watched a mother push her daughter on the swing. The sound of the child's laughter, high-pitched and carefree, was a sound I hadn't heard in 21 years. There were no screams there, just laughter. The sun was warm on my face. Slowly, I bent down and took off my shoes. I stepped onto the grass. It was cool and slightly damp. It was real. The feel of it under my feet made me gasp. I stood there, my shoes in my hand, my eyes closed, just feeling the earth beneath me, and I cried again. But this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was because of the grass. It was the first good feeling, the first feeling real, which I'd had since I was 28. I was no longer a ghost. I had weight. I was standing on the ground. And it was in that moment, with the grass beneath my feet, that I knew I had to do the last thing, the hardest thing. I had to go see Hannah's parents. It took a week. A week after I stepped onto the park grass. A whole week of looking at the phone number Mr. Harris had given me. Hannah's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Davies. I could have faced a firing squad more easily. What, in all conscience, could I say to them? I'm sorry I let you believe I murdered your only daughter for 21 years. I'm sorry I was so loyal to the man who killed her that I preferred to rot in a cell rather than tell you the truth. Each version sounded monstrous. It sounded insane, and it was. In prison, my silence seemed like a twisted form of nobility. Outside, in the sunlight, it seemed only a deep, sickening cowardice. I was a ghost haunting my own life, but to them, I was the monster haunting theirs. I had no right to ask them for forgiveness. I only had the obligation to finally give them my testimony. I dialed the number on a Tuesday morning. My hand was shaking so badly, I misdialed the digits twice. Finally, it rang. Once. Twice. A woman answered on the third ring. Hello? The voice was thin, fragile, like tissue paper. It was Mrs. Davies. I almost hung up. Panic closed my throat. Mrs. Davies, I managed, and my voice came out as a scratch. This is Claire Anderson. There was silence. Not an empty silence, but a heavy, full silence. The sound of 21 years of pain and hatred and confusion being processed. I could hear her breathing, a shaky sound. I thought she would scream. I thought she would curse me and slam the phone down. Instead, she just whispered, We were wondering if you would call. And then she cried, a single stifled sob. Can you come? Please. Mr. Harris offered to drive me. I declined. This wasn't a nice thing to do. This was a pilgrimage. I took a taxi. The 40-minute drive to their suburb felt like an eternity. It was the same house Hannah grew up in, the house I'd slept in so many times in high school. The neighborhood trees were bigger, older, the streets quieter. The taxi driver dropped me off at the curb. I stood there for a full minute, just staring. The house was perfectly manicured. The azaleas Mrs. Davies loved so much were blooming in vibrant shades of pink and white. It looked so normal, so peaceful. A sanctuary. And I was the defiler, returning to the scene. My legs felt like concrete as I walked along the stone sidewalk. I raised my hand to ring the doorbell, and it was shaking. The door opened before I could ring. She was there, Mrs. Davies. She was small, swallowed up by a gray cardigan. Her hair, which I remembered as a warm, light brown, was completely white and thin. She looked at me, and in her eyes, I saw everything. I saw the girl she treated like a second daughter. I saw the woman she hated in court. I saw the prisoner she saw on TV. And then, something broke. The hatred disappeared, and all that remained was a sadness so deep it took my breath away. "Claire," she breathed, and her hand went to her mouth. She reached out, not to hit me, but as if to touch a ghost. "Come in, please." The inside of the house smelled exactly as I remembered. Lemon wax, old books, and the faint aroma of coffee. And photos. Everywhere. Hannah. Baby Hannah. Hannah at her high school graduation, her arm around my shoulder. Hannah at her college graduation. And then, on the mantelpiece, the central photo, Hannah in her wedding dress, radiant, arm in arm with Mark. The photo hit me like a punch in the gut. They still had her. "We didn't know what to do," Mrs. Davies whispered, following my gaze. "We took her out, after what we found out." But the house felt so empty. She was so happy that day, or so we thought she was. Mr. Davies stood in the corner of the living room, in the wheelchair I'd seen in court. He didn't look angry. He looked broken. I stood in the middle of the carpet, a stain on their perfectly preserved home. I began, but my voice trailed off. "I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry." Mrs. Davies stared at me, and her eyes, once soft, hardened. "What are we sorry for, Claire? What I did? Or for what you didn't you?" The question hung in the air, sharp as a knife. "For what I didn't do," I said, meeting her eyes. "I'm sorry I stayed silent. I was young, and I was foolish. I thought I was protecting her memory. I thought it was better for the world to believe she died out of jealousy. Because jealousy, at least, implies love. The truth, that she died out of greed, for nothing, seemed too dirty. I'm sorry my silence stole your peace." Mr. Davies swiveled his chair slowly, the soft hum of the engine filling the room. "She told us, you know," he said, his voice a hoarse murmur. "A week ago, she came to dinner. She said she thought Mark was stealing from the company, that he was scaring her." He looked down at his hands, and we didn't believe her. "We told her it was the stress of the first year of marriage. We told her Mark was a good man and that she was being dramatic." Mrs. Davies began to cry, silent, terrible sobs that shook her frail body. We sent her back to him, Claire. We told her to be a good wife. And suddenly the courtroom I stood in was no longer between me and them. It was the three of us. 3 survivors of the same shipwreck. All of us betrayed by the same man. All of us living with our own silences. I moved instinctively, something I hadn't done in 21 years. I sat beside her on the couch and put my arm around her shoulders, and the 3 of us cried. We cried for Hannah. We cried for the lies we told ourselves. And we cried for the monster who smiled at us all. 6 months passed. 6 months since the day I cried in the Davies living room. 6 months since the outside world stopped feeling like an alien attack and began to feel, vaguely, like a place where I could exist. I got a job. Mr. Harris helped me. It was at a small used bookstore run by a kind man named Elias, who had sad eyes and didn't ask questions. He knew who I was. The Innocence Project had explained it. He didn't care. "People deserve second chapters, Mrs. Anderson," he told me, his voice redolent of pipe tobacco and paper dust. I liked it there. The smell of old books and polished wood was a balm. It was quiet. It was orderly. I spent my days cataloging, cleaning spines, recommending romance novels to elderly women. I was building a life, a very small, very quiet life, on the margins of reality. I lived in the small furnished apartment, which now had my own things. A set of blue dishes I bought at a thrift store, a vase that held fresh flowers, always yellow for Hannah, and a growing stack of books I was reading, devouring the 2 decades of stories I'd missed. I still had nightmares. I still woke in the middle of the night, disoriented, my heart pounding, thinking the walls were closing in, the smell of industrial bleach in my nose. I still jumped at a loud sound in the hallway, my body trained to associate sudden noises with violence. I didn't like crowds, but I was getting better. I could go to the supermarket now, as long as it was late at night, when it was nearly empty. I had mastered my smartphone, mainly for reading the news and listening to classical music, which calmed me. I was healing, or maybe healing is the wrong word. I was scarring. The tissue was hard and ugly, but it wasn't bleeding anymore. I had almost stopped waiting for the phone to ring. The search for Mark had become an abstract thing, a background noise in my new life. The world was big. He had money. He was gone. I began to accept that his doomsday might never come, and I would have to find a way to live with that. The call came one April morning. It was a Thursday. I remember the spring sun streaming through the bookstore window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I was helping a customer find a gardening book. I was smiling, a real smile. My phone, the small black rectangle that now lived in my pocket, vibrated. I excused myself and looked. Private number. My stomach sank. But it was always private number. I answered. Hello? Claire? It's Mr. Harris. His voice. It was different. It wasn't the nervousness of our first meeting, nor the shocked anger of our second. It was restrained. There was a tension in it, a dark, satisfied energy. The energy of a hunter who has finally cornered his prey. I stepped out from behind the counter and went to the back of the store, to the small, musty-smelling storage room. What is it? We found him, Claire. The words were so simple, but they hit my chest and stopped my heart. The gardening book I was still holding slipped from my hand and fell to the floor with a thud. We got him. The air in the storage room grew thin. The smell of old paper suddenly choked me. Where? I whispered. A small island, he said, off the coast of Spain. He'd been living there for 15 years, false name, new identity, new wife. Of course he would have a new wife. Mark didn't know how to be alone. He needed someone to absorb his darkness, someone to be his shield. He was extradited this morning, Harris continued, his voice now quick, professional. He's on American soil. He's in a federal holding cell now. The prosecution is taking over the case. The trial will be quick. The evidence is overwhelming. The coffin letter, Exhibit B, the international financial records we found. He has nowhere to run. I leaned against a shelf of history books, dust staining my blouse. He was caught. That abstract phantom, that monster in my memories, was real now. He was here, in the same country, breathing the same air. The small, fragile life I'd built over the last 6 months felt like a house of cards, and someone had just flung open the door in a gale. The quiet woman from the bookstore was gone. Inmate 409 was scared. But there was a third person there, too. A woman I barely knew. A woman forged in that courtroom. Forged in the cold rage of that hotel room. The witness. Claire? Harris said, his voice pulling my mind back. Are you there? I took a deep breath, the smell of dust and time steadying me. Yes, I said. My voice didn't shake. I'm here. I figured you'd want to know, he said softly. The arraignment is tomorrow. I know, I said. I want to see you. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a statement. The silence on the line lasted only a second. Harris didn't argue this time. He didn't mention what healthy was. I figured you'd say that, he replied, his voice now aligned with mine. I'll be there to pick you up at 8. I didn't sleep that night, but it wasn't the haunted, restless sleep of prison. It wasn't a drift into nightmares. It was a wake. I sat in the armchair in my apartment, watching the city lights flicker below, listening to the distant sirens, sounds of life going on. I wasn't afraid. The fear had been burned away, replaced by something cold and hard. I was a witness. I was Hannah's living memory. I was the receipt for Mark's debt. In the morning, I showered and dressed carefully. Not the cheap gray suit of my release, the clothes of a victim. I chose a simple dress, dark blue, the color of truth. I looked in the mirror. The woman staring back at me wasn't the 28-year-old he'd destroyed, nor the 40-something inmate hiding. She was someone new, and she was ready. Mr. Harris picked me up at 8 o'clock sharp, his face grim, a respectful nod. The ride was silent. There was nothing to say. The courtroom was packed. It was a circus. Unlike my mistrial hearing, which had been administrative and quiet, this one was for the show. Reporters huddled in the back rows, their notebooks open. Courtroom artists scribbled on their pads. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, expensive perfume, and the electricity of public anticipation. I felt a flash of nausea. They were here to see the monster. For them, it was entertainment. For me, it was the epilogue of my life. Harris led me to the front row, just behind the prosecution team. And then I saw them. Hannah's parents. They were already seated, Mrs. Davies holding her husband's hand. She turned, saw me, and her eyes held no hate. They had a wedding ring. She patted the empty seat next to her. I sat with them. We were the survivors, the three of us, waiting. The room fell silent as the judge entered. All rise. The same formality that had condemned me was now being used to condemn him. The judge sat. Bring in the defendant. And then the side door opened. My heart didn't race. It stopped. He stood completely still in my chest. I held my breath. I had spent 21 years imagining this moment. In my nightmares, he entered as I remembered. Tall, charming, with an easy smile, the devil in an expensive suit. The man who entered wasn't him. The man 2 officers dragged into the room was old. I knew he would have aged, of course, but this was different. His hair, once thick and brown, was almost completely white, thin and flat against his scalp. He wore the same orange jumpsuit I had worn for so many years. The color looked garish on him. He was hunched over. He looked small, fragile, broken. The monster that haunted my life, the architect of my downfall, the master manipulator. He was just a scared old man. He sat at the defense table, handcuffed, and kept his eyes on the floor, refusing to look up. The prosecutor, a sharp young man who saw this case as his career, was brutal. He was methodical. He didn't need flourishes. He had the evidence. He read the letter from the coffin. He presented the financial records. He showed the photos of Exhibit B, Hannah's confession in her own handwriting. With each new piece of evidence, Mark's body seemed to shrink a little more. I watched him. I studied him. I searched for the man I loved, the man who laughed with me, the man who held me. He wasn't there. There was nothing of him, just this empty shell. The judge asked the prosecutor if there was anything else. No, Your Honor. The case is clear. The judge then turned to Mark. Mr. Collins, how do you plead to the charges of first-degree murder and fraud? That's when he looked up. He didn't look at the referee. He looked out at the crowd. His eyes, once bright blue, were now cloudy and bloodshot. He was looking for me. He needed to see me. And then, he found me. Our eyes met across the courtroom. 21 years, 2 lives, 1 grave. It all came down to that moment. I felt Mrs. Davies grab my hand. I felt the air sucked from the room. I expected to feel hatred. I expected a volcanic rage to rise and make me scream. I expected to feel something. But the truth, the terrible, liberating truth, was that I felt nothing. Just a vast, cold, clean void. The man who defined my entire life, the axis around which my world had shattered, was a stranger. A pathetic stranger, and he saw it in my eyes. He saw the absence. The calculation I saw in his eyes at the top of the stairs, I saw again. But it wasn't to incriminate me anymore. It was desperation. He was searching for the 28-year-old girl who loved him, and he didn't find her. He found me. His public defense attorney, who looked overwhelmed and disgusted, whispered in his ear. Mark nodded. He stood, or tried to, his chains rattling. Guilty, he said, his voice a hoarse rasp that barely filled the room. Guilty on all charges. A collective gasp ran through the gallery. No trial, no fight. He was giving up. The judge looked surprised. Given the plea, the judge said, sentencing will take place immediately. Does Mr. Collins have anything to say in his defense? Mark's attorney shook his head, but Mark interrupted him. I do, he said, and he looked directly at me, ignoring the judge, ignoring Hannah's parents. He looked at me. Claire, he said, I'm sorry. That was it. I'm sorry, Claire. And that was the final betrayal. It wasn't an apology. It was a performance. It was a final attempt at manipulation, at making us one. Us again. I'm sorry, Claire, as if we were accomplices, as if her pain, her death, were just an obstacle in our tragic love story. He wasn't sorry for the murder. He was sorry for getting caught. The judge banged his gavel. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. I didn't even hear it. I just looked at him, and as they led him away, I didn't look away. And for the first time, he was the one who broke eye contact. The sound of the judge's gavel hitting seemed to echo in my bones. Life imprisonment. The words hung in the musty air of the courtroom. And then, chaos. Mark was pulled out through a side door, a ghost in orange, gone. The gallery exploded. Reporters rushed to their phones in the hallway, shouting, "Guilty!" into their small black cameras. Cameras flashed, though there was nothing else to see. It was over. The monster had a name, a sentence, and a cell. Beside me, Mrs. Davies was sobbing, a deep, exhausted cry that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, her body shaking. Mr. Davies just stared straight ahead at the empty defense chair where Mark had been, and silent tears, the first I'd ever seen him shed, streamed down his wrinkled face. It was over. I expected to feel relief. I expected to feel justice like a warm balm, a weight lifted from my shoulders, but I didn't. I felt hollow. The big, ugly, 21-year-old mountain had been climbed, and at the top there was nothing. Just thin air and the sight of another mountain. The mountain Ofrest of my life. Mr. Harris touched me on the shoulder, his hand firm. Claire, let's get you out of here. The press is going crazy. He and a court security guard led the Davises and me down a back hallway, away from the cameras and the screams. The courtroom's smell of dust and stale coffee followed us. In that quiet, fluorescent-lit hallway, Mrs. Davies stopped. She turned to me. She didn't hug me. She gripped my arms, her slender fingers digging into my skin with desperate strength. It's over, Claire, she whispered, as if trying to convince herself. He can't hurt anyone else. I looked into her eyes, red and swollen, and saw the same emptiness I felt. His sentence wouldn't bring Hannah back. It wouldn't erase the 21 years she believed I was the killer. It wouldn't erase the 21 years they hated me. He's gone, I said. It was the only truth I had. Mr. Davies reached out from his wheelchair and placed his hand over mine. His hand was cold. You were brave today, girl, he murmured. Hannah would be proud. That almost broke me. Harris drove me home. The silence in the car was thick, heavy as a wet blanket. Are you okay? He asked, his voice professional as ever, but his eyes were tired. I don't know what okay means, I answered honestly, staring out the window at the buildings passing by. I thought I'd see the man I remembered. I thought I'd feel anger, but he was just a ghost. A pathetic ghost. He'll die in prison, Claire. It's justice. It's justice, I agreed. But it's not the end. Not for me. I knew with sudden clarity what I needed. There was one last piece. One last voice that needed to be heard. The letter, I said, turning to him in the passenger seat. The original, the one they took out of the coffin, not the copy. The that. Harris frowned. Claire, this is evidence. It's sealed in the case file. The trial is over, I cut him off, and the voice that came out wasn't inmate 409's nor the frightened girls. It was the 49-year-old woman's voice. He confessed. It's mine. It's addressed to me. I need it, Mr. Harris. I'm not going to ask the court. I'm asking you. He looked at me for a long moment. He understood. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was a good man. He nodded. I'll see what I can do. It took 2 days. 2 days of staying in my apartment, the world outside celebrating justice, while I felt more trapped than ever, stuck in limbo between the end of the nightmare and the beginning of nothing. Then, Harris appeared at my door. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing jeans. He carried a large manila envelope with official red stamps. The judge has released it. It belongs to you, Claire. Legally. My hands shook as I picked it up. It was light. How could it be so light when it carried the weight of 3 lives? I waited until he left. I closed the door, locked it. I made a cup of tea, the ritual of normalcy. I sat at my small kitchen table, the afternoon sun streaming through the window. I looked at the envelope. Inside was the plastic evidence bag. Inside was the stained paper. I took it out. The plastic was cool to the touch. I broke the seal. The paper was brittle and smelled like earth. And something chemical, the smell of formaldehyde, the smell of death. Hannah's handwriting was tight, hurried, the letters slanting to the right. She was afraid as she wrote. Claire began. My Claire. If you're reading this, I'm dead. And I'm so scared. I could hear her. I could hear her voice, the way she always got breathless when she was upset. I read the parts the court read. The money, Mark's lies, the warning about him using me. But then, I read the part the court didn't read aloud. The part that was only for me. I know you still love him, Claire. I saw it in your eyes at the cafe. And that's why I'm so scared for you. He's not who you think. He's not the man you loved. He's a black hole. He consumes everything. He consumed me. And if I die, he'll try to consume you. He'll use your love, your loyalty, as a shield. He'll make you the villain because he knows you'd rather break than see him break. I had to stop reading. I was choking. She knew. She knew me. She knew me better than I knew myself. She saw my sacrifice before I even made it. She saw my prison sentence in my own loyal eyes. I read the rest. The part about the copy. The part about burn it. And then, the last line. The line that was just for me. Don't let him take you away from you. I love you, even now. Forgive me for bringing him into our lives. Live for both of us. And that's when I broke. The tears I hadn't cried at my release. The tears I hadn't cried at his trial. They came. A flood. I cried for the 28-year-old who went to prison. I cried for the 49-year-old who got out. But most of all, I cried for Hannah, my friend, who, even as her world crumbled, her last thought was to protect me. And I failed her. I didn't save myself. I let my silence be my sentence. I didn't sleep that night, my last night. After Mark's trial, I was taken back, not to a holding cell, but to my own. 409, a final bureaucratic formality, or perhaps a final act of poetic cruelty. Mr. Harris assured me that my final release papers, the official state documents, would be ready by 9 in the morning. I'll be there at the gate, he promised on his last visit. You won't be leaving alone. So I sat on my hard bunk. The thin mattress, the scratchy blanket, the smell of bleach and metal. Everything so familiar, but now it felt like a movie set, something no longer real, like a snakeskin I was about to shed. In my hands was the letter. Hannah's original letter, the one that smelled of earth and formaldehyde. I read it again, and again, in the dim cell light that never quite dimmed until the words became my breath. Don't let him take you away from you. Live for both of us. An order, a gift, a responsibility. I thought of fire. I thought of Hannah's command. Burn it. The court had taken care of Mark. He was in his own cell now, beginning his own concrete eternity. He was burning. But what about this letter? This last ghost? I couldn't burn it here. It would be arson, a final irony. And suddenly, I realized I didn't need to. The fire wasn't for the paper. It was for the guilt. The fire was the decision, right there, that night, to stop being inmate 409 forever. The fire was acceptance. I folded the fragile paper carefully and tucked it into the pocket of the cheap jeans they'd given me to wear in the morning. It was the only thing I would take with me from that place. Not as a relic of the past, but as a map to the future. I lay down and stared at the cracked ceiling, the same ceiling I'd studied for 7,148 nights. I knew every line, every water stain. I had traced maps in the stars of those cracks, imagining constellations in decay. And I thought about the woman who walked in here. The 28-year-old girl, blinded by love, broken by betrayal, who chose silence over truth. I hated her for so long. I despised her. I blamed her for every day I lost, for every visit my parents made where I could see the shame in their eyes, for every night I woke with my heart pounding to the sound of keys. I saw her as weak, stupid, a fool. But there, on my last night, in cell 409, with Hannah's promise in my pocket, I finally saw her clearly. She wasn't weak. She was heartbroken. She was terrified. She had lost the man she loved and the friend she loved in the same instant, and she simply broke. She did the best she could with the broken pieces she'd been given. And there, in the dark, with the familiar sound of a woman crying in another cell, I forgave her. I forgave that girl. I finally let her go. I realized that true liberation wasn't the judge banging the gavel. It wasn't the gate opening tomorrow. This was it. It was the moment you stopped being a prisoner of your own past. And I realized that reflecting on the invisible prison wasn't something I would learn in 5 years. It was tonight's lesson. We all have prisons, and the strongest ones don't have barbed wire. We build them with our fears. We build them with our regrets. We build them with the silences we keep to protect the people we love, or to shield ourselves from the truth of who we really are. We lock ourselves in jobs we hate, marriages that died years ago, or memories of pain we refuse to let go of. We become the jailers of our own lives, pacing in circles in the same emotional prison yard, day after day, afraid of what would happen if we just stopped. My prison was literal, but the deepest, the strongest, was the one I built inside myself. Cell 409 had walls I could see. The cell of my silence was invisible and much stronger. Mr. Harris told me I was free. The judge told me I was free. But it was Hannah's voice, coming from the grave, that finally gave me the key. And on this final night, I used it. I didn't know what the outside world held for me. I had no home, no money, no family. I was a 49-year-old woman, being born again in the middle of my life, and it was terrifying. But it was real. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to rest. Tomorrow, life would begin. Tomorrow, I would begin living for us. The morning sun streamed through the high crack in the cell window, not like a friend, but like a spotlight. It was 9:00 in the morning. I hadn't slept. I'd lain, listening to the sounds of the prison waking for the last time, the buzz of the lights intensifying at 5, the first shouts of the guards, the rattle of the breakfast cart, the metallic clang of the cell doors being unlocked for the count. When Miller stopped at my door, she didn't bark. She just looked at me. Anderson, time to go. She didn't look angry or happy, just tired. The bureaucracy of my life ending was just another piece of paper on her desk. Get up. I stood. The thin mattress didn't make a sound. I was already dressed in the cheap jeans and white t-shirt they'd given me. Donated clothes. I had no belongings to collect. 21 years old, and all I had was in my pocket. Hannah's letter. Let's go, Miller said. I walked out of cell 409. I didn't look back. Looking back was how you turned to stone. The walk down the corridor I'd taken 1,000 times felt different. Each step echoed with a finality that made my knees tremble. The other women, they knew. The news had spread like wildfire. They stood at their doors, silent. No one applauded, no one jeered. They just watched. Their faces were a mix of envy, hope, and a kind of sadness. I was proof that it was possible to get out, but I was also the exception that proved the rule. I was the winning lottery ticket, and they were the ones still holding the losing tickets. Maria, from the next cell, was there. She gave me a short nod. "Breathe slowly, Anderson," she murmured. "The air out there is different. It's fast." I nodded. They took me to exit processing, a windowless beige room that smelled of sweat and old files. They fingerprinted me. Again. They took my picture. Again. "For the release file," the guard said, bored. They handed me an envelope with $20, gate money, and my release papers. A document that said the state of Texas apologized for the miscarriage of justice. Such a small word to steal someone's life. "Follow the green line," the guard said. I followed the green line painted on the concrete floor, a line I'd never been allowed to follow. It led me to a series of gates. The first gate was steel. A guard in a glass booth pressed a button. The loud hum of the electrical mechanism, a sound that used to mean locked, now meant open. It slid aside with a bang. I stepped through. It closed behind me with a thud that shook the floor. I stood in a small concrete corridor, a sally port. There was another gate ahead of me. I waited. The silence was deafening. I was alone between the two gates, the final purgatory. I could see the outside world through the barbed wire at the top of the second gate. I could see the sky, a patch of bright blue sky, not the gray slice of the courtyard. The second gate hummed. It opened. I could feel the air real. It was the outside air, and it smelled of cut grass and car exhaust. It was thick. The prison air was thin and recycled, smelling of steel and disinfectant. This air had life into it. I took a step, and another. And then my feet were no longer on the polished concrete of the prison. They were on the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. I was out. I stopped. The sun, the real sun on my face, unfiltered by dirty windows or barbed wire. It was warm. It was so bright. I had to close my eyes against it. The sounds were deafening. A truck passed on a nearby highway, the sound of its tires on the asphalt like a roar. Birds. I hadn't heard real birds in 21 years. Their calls were high-pitched and confused. The air was moving. Wind. I felt the wind on my face, in my hair. It was so aggressive. My whole body was tense, as if expecting a blow. I was breathing too fast, just as Maria had said. The air was too rich. I was drowning in it. I opened my eyes. The vastness. There were no walls. The sky went on forever. I felt small and exposed, like a creature who had lived under a rock and was suddenly turned to the sun. I wanted to run back inside. Back to cell 409, back to the ordered silence and the walls I knew. "Claire?" A voice. I turned, blinking. Mr. Harris was there, standing next to an ordinary car. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was in jeans, looking like a normal human being. He was smiling, a small, gentle smile. I took a step toward him, and my legs gave way. The ground suddenly seemed to be tilting. Harris rushed over and caught me by the arm before I fell. "I got you," he said. "It's okay. You're okay. You're free." He guided me to the car, the asphalt uneven under my unfamiliar feet. He opened the passenger door for me. I looked inside. It was just a car, but it felt like a spaceship. I got in, the seat soft, swallowing me. Harris got in, started the car. Music began playing softly on the radio. I jumped. He turned it off immediately. "Sorry," he said. "It's okay," I whispered. He put the car in drive, and we started moving. Fast. The world rushed past the window, the buildings, the trees, the other people. Everything was a blur of color and movement. I gripped the armrest, my heart pounding in my throat. 21 years at a slow walk, and now I was going 40 miles an hour. I felt sick, but I also felt alive. I was moving. I wasn't standing still anymore. I was going somewhere, and I had no idea where. Mr. Harris drove slowly, with a caution I appreciated. My eyes tried to take it all in, but the world was too fast, too loud, too colorful. It was a sensory assault, and I felt like a diver who descended too quickly, my body aching from the pressure change. "Where to?" he asked softly, his voice professional but gentle. "The project has a safe apartment for you. A few miles from here. An apartment. A room. Another box." I looked out the window, my reflection staring back. A pale, strange woman with frightened eyes. I couldn't go to another box. Not yet. There was a debt that needed to be paid. A circle that needed to be closed. Can you stop at a flower shop?" I asked, my voice sounding like a whisper in my own ears. He looked surprised, but nodded. "Sure, Claire." He stopped at a small corner store. I hadn't asked him to wait. I had to. I got out of the car, my legs unsteady on the gravel. The bell above the door jingled as I entered. The smell hit me first. Not bleach, not sweat, not metal. The smell of damp earth, green leaves, and flowers. It was so sweet, so vibrant. It made me dizzy. I leaned against a counter. A young woman looked at me with concern. "Ma'am, are you okay?" "I am," I lied. I need a rose." "What color?" she asked, smiling. "We have red, white, yellow," I said, the word coming out with a certainty that surprised me. "Just one, yellow." She wrapped it in cellophane, the crinkling sound making me jump. I paid with one of the $20 bills the guard had given me, the gate money, the first money I'd touched in 21 years. I walked back to the car, holding the rose like a weapon, or maybe an anchor. Mr. Harris looked at it, but didn't ask. He just started the car. "Where now?" "You know where it is," I said. "Oakwood Cemetery." He nodded again. He understood. He was a good man. He drove in silence. 20 minutes later, we were there. The wrought iron gates were open. He stopped the car on the small gravel road. "Do you want me to go with you?" "No," I said. I need to do this alone." I walked out. The cemetery air was quiet, but it was a different quiet than the prison. It was a peaceful quiet, filled with the sound of wind in the tall trees. I walked, my donation shoes crunching in the grass. I found her headstone easily. New grass had already grown over the disturbed earth from the exhumation, but it was still a visible scar on the ground. The headstone was simple, just like the Davieses, Hannah Davies Collins, beloved daughter and wife. The word wife still hurt me, a lie etched in stone. But it didn't matter anymore. The stone was there for the living. The truth was elsewhere. I knelt in the dirt, the scent of fresh soil rising. I didn't cry. I was beyond tears. I was hollow, but in a good way. Empty. Ready. "Hi, Han," I whispered. The wind carried my words. "I'm out. Finally." I pulled the letter from my pocket. The letter that smelled of earth and death. The letter that gave me my life back. I held it against the cold tombstone. I read it. I understand. He's gone, Hannah. Mark is gone. He's in a cell, just like I was. It's over. I unwrapped the yellow rose, its thorns scratching my fingers, the small pain anchoring me in the moment. "I don't know how to do this," I said, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to live for myself, let alone for the two of us, but I'll try." I placed the yellow rose on the ground, right on top of the scar in the earth. It was a small spot of bright color against the green and gray. A beginning. I stayed there, kneeling, for a long time. I didn't pray. I didn't know how else. I just stayed. I felt the sun on my back. I felt the wind. And for the first time in 7,248 days, I didn't feel the weight of my silence. It was gone. I was no longer protecting Mark. I was no longer hiding from Hannah. I was just Claire. And for the first time in my adult life, that seemed to be enough. I stood up. I left the letter there, next to the rose, weighed down by a small stone. It no longer belonged to me. It belonged to her. I turned and walked back to the car without looking back. Mr. Harris was waiting, just as he said he would. I got in the car. The silence was there, but it was no longer heavy. He started the engine. "What now, Claire?" he asked. I looked out the window, at the world passing quickly, the world that no longer had walls. "Now," I said, "I begin. Sometimes I think God just sits with you in the dark, in the silence, waiting for you to stop looking at the walls you've built and finally look up, waiting for you to be ready to find your own voice." My voice was found in the whisper of a dead friend, hidden in the darkness, a final gift of love. If you've ever felt trapped by a mistake you made, trapped by a secret you're keeping, or trapped by someone else's silence, know that truth has a way of breathing. Even underground, even after 21 years, it will find a way. This story isn't mine. It belongs to her. Hannah's memory isn't about her death anymore. It's about her voice. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even the deepest silence can one day be broken, and that even in the most broken soil, something beautiful, something like a yellow rose, can still find a way to grow. This story was a mirror. We want to know what you saw reflected in it. Leave your story in the comments below. Have you ever been a prisoner of silence? Do you believe true justice was his conviction or her pardon? Your voice is the most important part of our community. For more true stories that explore the fine line between guilt, faith, and redemption, subscribe in the Prison Diary and activate the bell. Your journey with us is just beginning.